Stay in the kitchen. Your sister is entertaining the VIP investors tonight, Dad commanded during the grand opening of our family restaurant. I took off my apron, walked out the back door, and drove away. 10 minutes later, the lead investor stood up in the dining room. The Michelin-star chef I came to fund just texted me that she quit, he announced. He tore up the $5 million check right in front of them. That was the least of their problems that began that night. The shocking audacity of my father's command was the final, fatal fracture in a decade of profound financial and emotional manipulation, masked as familial duty. We were standing in the sweltering, chaotic prep area of Viridia, a highly anticipated fine dining establishment located in the center of Boston's Seaport District, an enterprise I had built from the ground up over the past 14 months. The dining room beyond the swinging metal doors was packed with local politicians, food critics, and the executive board of Frost Capital, the venture firm expected to provide our essential operating liquidity. I had spent the last 18 hours straight on my feet, butchering whole lambs, reducing complex demi-glaces, and directing a brigade of 20 line cooks to ensure the opening night service was flawless. My father, David, stood blocking the exit wearing a custom Italian suit, his face flushed with the arrogant thrill of playing the successful restaurateur, while contributing absolutely nothing to the actual labor. You want me to stay hidden while Vanessa pitches my entire menu to the firm? I asked, lowering my chef's knife onto the cutting board. David adjusted his expensive silk tie, offering me a look of pure, unadulterated condescension, before saying, Vanessa has the personality for the front of house. She knows how to talk to people with money. You are covered in grease and bone broth. You just cook the food, let your sister secure the capital. I had spent 7 grueling years in Lyon, France, working my way up from a lowly vegetable chopper to the executive chef of a globally recognized establishment, eventually earning my own Michelin star through my own relentless, exhausting labor. 2 years ago, David and my mother Helen had flown to France, weeping in my small apartment, begging me to return to Boston because they claimed they had secured a prime real estate location and wanted to build a legacy family business. They promised me absolute creative control and a 50% ownership stake, insisting they would handle the business administration and permit my younger sister Vanessa to manage the front-of-house hospitality. Vanessa possessed a communications degree and absolutely zero restaurant experience, but my parents had spent her entire life shielding her from actual effort, treating her as a delicate prodigy who simply needed the right platform to shine. I trusted my family, signing the dense stacks of incorporation paperwork they placed in front of me upon my return, entirely focused on designing the kitchen infrastructure, sourcing local farm contracts, and developing the menu. I did not realize they had orchestrated a massive legal fraud until 3 hours before the grand opening service commenced. I had walked into David's private office to retrieve a stack of printed dietary restrictions for the VIP tables, and resting exposed on his desk was the glossy 70-page investor prospectus created specifically for the Frost Capital executives. I picked it up, expecting to review the financial projections, but instead, I found a fabricated corporate hierarchy that legally listed Vanessa as the sole founder, chief executive officer, and culinary visionary of Viridia. My name was completely absent from the executive roster, and when I flipped to the back appendix, I finally located myself buried in the staff directory under the title of kitchen manager, designated as an at-will employee with a stagnant annual salary and absolutely zero equity in the company I had designed. My parents had used my name, my culinary reputation, and my international industry connections to secure the initial meetings with the investment firms. But when it came time to legally incorporate the entity, they placed the entire enterprise in Vanessa's name. They genuinely viewed my culinary expertise as low-class, blue-collar labor, believing that Vanessa's ability to wear a designer dress and smile at wealthy men was the actual valuable asset generating the interest. They assumed investors simply wanted a beautiful face to market the brand, entirely ignorant of the fact that high-level venture capitalists in the hospitality sector invest exclusively in the chef creating the product. I looked at David standing by the kitchen doors, utterly blind to the reality of the industry he was attempting to conquer, genuinely believing he could lock the engine of the restaurant in a hot room and sell the empty chassis to billionaires. I did not scream. I did not throw pots across the room, and I did not demand an immediate explanation, because confronting a narcissist in the middle of their perceived victory only gives them an opportunity to manipulate the narrative. I simply replied that I understood his instructions, watching his face break into a smug, satisfied smile as he told me to keep the venison portions small to maximize the profit margins, before he turned around and pushed through the doors into the glamorous dining room to join his golden child. I did not return to the cutting board. I untied the heavy canvas apron from my waist, dropped it directly onto the stainless steel prep counter, and looked at my sous chef, instructing him to box up his knives because the service was entirely dead. I walked out the rear alley door into the freezing night air, completely abandoning the kitchen, the menu, and the fraudulent family that had attempted to steal my future, knowing with absolute certainty that the entire illusion was about to violently collapse the second the investors realized they were buying a lie. I got into my car and drove 3 blocks away to a quiet, empty parking lot overlooking the harbor, rolling down the window to let the freezing coastal wind clear the smell of the kitchen from my clothes before pulling out my phone to open a direct text message thread with Maxwell Frost. Maxwell was the billionaire founder of the investment firm currently sitting at table 4 inside the restaurant, and I had personally cultivated a strong professional relationship with him over the past 2 years, after he dined at my establishment in France multiple times, only agreeing to evaluate the Boston project because of my direct, promised involvement. I typed a brief, clinical message informing him to check the corporate prospectus, explaining that David and Vanessa had legally cut me out of all equity, that I was listed merely as an employee, that I had just walked out the back door, and explicitly advising him not to fund their fraudulent holding company. I reclined my car seat, watching the city lights reflect off the dark water, waiting for the inevitable explosion to occur back at the venue. The detonation happened exactly 10 minutes later, and according to the frantic, terrified voicemails that began flooding my phone from various staff members, the sequence of events inside the dining room was a display of absolute, catastrophic humiliation for my family. Maxwell Frost had just finished his first course when my text message vibrated in his pocket. He read the screen, calmly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and requested a physical copy of the final corporate prospectus from David. David, completely oblivious to the trap closing around him, eagerly handed over the glossy booklet, proudly pointing to Vanessa's photograph on the executive page, while Vanessa stood by the table wearing a stunning red gown, holding the ceremonial $5 million initial disbursement check that Frost Capital had brought for the scheduled press photographs. Maxwell stood up from the table, completely ignoring the flashing cameras, and commanded the room with cold, uncompromising authority, asking exactly where Chef Nora was. David stepped forward, offering a smooth, completely fabricated lie, claiming I was feeling a bit under the weather and resting in the back, but insisting Vanessa was entirely prepared to discuss the national franchise expansion. Maxwell looked directly at Vanessa, bypassing the financial questions entirely, and asked her to explain the enzymatic breakdown process utilized in the venison marinade she had just served him. Vanessa froze entirely, the confident smile vanishing from her face as she looked at David in sheer panic, completely incapable of pronouncing the basic ingredients, let alone explaining the complex chemical reactions of the dish she supposedly invented. Maxwell turned his gaze back to my father, announcing to the entire silent room that the Michelin-star chef he came to fund had just texted him her resignation because they legally reduced the only valuable asset in the building to a kitchen manager. Maxwell reached out, took the ceremonial $5 million check from Vanessa's trembling hands, and tore it completely in half, right in front of the entire executive board and the local press, stating clearly that Frost Capital invests in culinary genius, not in fraudulent holding companies designed to fund a daughter's vanity project. He signaled his team, and the entire board of directors walked out of the restaurant, leaving my family standing in the center of a silent dining room, completely exposed and entirely devoid of the capital they desperately needed to survive the night. The financial reality of their arrogance was deeply terrifying, because David had not simply leased the building. He had secured a massive $2 million short-term bridge loan against his own personal home to fund the lavish construction, the imported Italian marble, and the expensive marketing campaign for the grand opening. He had banked his entire financial existence on securing Frost's $5 million injection to clear that toxic debt and provide operating capital for the first year. Without that funding, and without a chef capable of cooking the highly technical menu, the restaurant was instantly insolvent, triggering penalty clauses in the bridge loan that demanded immediate repayment. My phone rang continuously for the next 3 hours, displaying dozens of calls from David, Helen, and Vanessa, all of which I completely ignored until an unknown number flashed on the screen. I answered it, hearing Maxwell's calm voice asking if I was still in the city. I confirmed my location, and he instructed me to meet him at his hotel lounge, stating we had a legitimate business to build entirely separate from the wreckage of my family. I met Maxwell in a quiet, empty bar on the top floor of his hotel, and we spent the next 4 hours drafting a totally new corporate structure where I would retain 80% ownership, complete creative control, and absolute legal authority over all operations. Frost Capital would provide the necessary funding in exchange for a 20% equity stake, completely bypassing the need for any outside management or family interference. My parents' names were not mentioned a single time during the intense negotiations, their entire existence rendered completely irrelevant to my future success. I signed the preliminary term sheet at 2 a.m, securing my financial independence and permanently severing the toxic tether, tying me to people who viewed my talent as a resource to be stolen rather than respected. Viridia completely collapsed in less than 14 days. David desperately attempted to hire a replacement executive chef to save the project, but the local culinary community had already heard about the ownership fraud and the dramatic walkout, meaning absolutely no reputable cook would step foot inside the building. The bank officially called in the massive bridge loan entirely, and because David had aggressively secured the debt against his personal assets rather than forming a protected limited liability corporation, the foreclosure process on my parents' house began immediately. 3 weeks later, I was standing in a completely gutted commercial space across the city, reviewing architectural blueprints with my new general contractor for a restaurant I entirely owned, when the front doors violently banged open. David, Helen, and Vanessa marched into the dusty room looking absolutely ruined, the physical toll of their financial collapse entirely evident on their faces. David's expensive suit was wrinkled and stained. Helen looked completely exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, and Vanessa lacked any of her usual glamorous arrogance, wearing plain clothes and clutching her purse nervously. David begged me to help them fix the situation immediately, his voice cracking with desperation, as he stated the bank was taking the house and Vanessa's credit was completely destroyed. He asked me to call Mr. Frost, insisting I tell the investor it was all a simple misunderstanding and that I would return to cook at their venue. I rolled up the architectural blueprints, placed them onto a wooden crate, and looked at the 3 people who had actively conspired to steal my intellectual property and reduce my life's work to a minimum wage position. I told David there was absolutely no misunderstanding, detailing exactly how he created a fraudulent corporate structure to steal my labor, intending to lock me in a hot kitchen for the rest of my life, while Vanessa paraded around taking the credit and spending the profits. I pointed out that he assumed I was too stupid to read a prospectus, and he assumed Maxwell Frost was too stupid to know who actually cooks his food. Helen stepped forward, crying out that they were my family, claiming they did what was best for everyone because Vanessa needed a career. I immediately corrected her, stating that Vanessa needed a job, but a career is earned through actual labor and expertise. They gambled their family home on a vanity project, and lost entirely due to their own greed. I did not owe them a single cent of my future to cover the debts they accumulated trying to exploit me. David snarled, his anger completely masking his overwhelming fear, calling me a selfish, ungrateful child and declaring I would fail without them handling the business administration, because I supposedly knew nothing about running a company. I picked up the blueprints, looking directly into my father's eyes, and informed him I currently owned 80% of a fully funded hospitality group while he was facing personal bankruptcy, strongly suggesting they leave my property before I called the police to have them arrested for trespassing. They stood there in the dust for a long moment, waiting for me to break, waiting for the daughter they had always bullied and marginalized to apologize and save them from the consequences of their own actions. I simply stared back, offering absolutely nothing, projecting a cold, uncompromising authority that finally forced them to recognize the total finality of the situation. They turned around and walked out into the street, entirely defeated by their own catastrophic greed, realizing they possessed absolutely zero leverage over my life. My real restaurant opened 8 months later to overwhelming critical acclaim, securing advanced reservations booked out for an entire year within the first week of operation. I built a brilliant, dedicated team, I served food that I completely owned, and I never spoke to my parents or my sister again. They lost their house entirely, moving into a small, cramped rental apartment, while David was forced to take a mid-level management job at a logistics firm to pay off the remaining aggressive creditors. Vanessa was unable to secure any corporate positions due to the public humiliation of the Frost Capital incident, ultimately forcing her to accept an entry-level retail position at a local mall, completely stripped of the unearned executive title she had flaunted for exactly one night. I proved what they failed to understand about the hospitality industry. The people sweating in the back of the house hold all the actual power, because you cannot serve a billionaire investor an empty plate, no matter how beautiful the person carrying it claims to be.